Hi, everybody. Oh, that is loud. Hi, everybody. Welcome tonight. It's so wonderful to see you all, and welcome to all of you at home. We're glad you can join us. My name is Elena Brokaw. I work here at the Museum of Ventura County, and I've been here for about 5.5 years, and I have to say that one of my favorite items in our museum's arsenal is the incomparable Ivor Davis.
Oh, well, I have become an artifact.
Well, you are a living. We're a living museum. You're a living history. Now, Ivor has worked with us for so long to bring our history to life, and we are so thankful to him. And so, without further ado, I will turn it over to Mr. Ivor Davis. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you all for coming, and it's a pleasure to see all your faces, and also I can't see the faces on Zoom, but I know we have people watching from the East Coast, from Australia, from even Oxnard. Now, I must confess that when I was told about tonight's distinguished guest, David Leaf, and it was told to me by producer, director Steve Binder, who was a previous guest here and who was the guy that directed that brilliant Elvis Presley comeback 68 concert. I was not that familiar with David's work, but I quickly discovered that his body of work is phenomenal. You've got to find out. He is a Renaissance man of film, television, music, and the written word. Tonight, you will see and you will hear why David Leaf is a walking, talking, multi-dimensional human encyclopedia. He knows everything about music and so much more. You will be mesmerized, I promise you. You'll get your money back if you're not mesmerized. You'll be mesmerized by what he knows, and particularly by what he says, by his wit, his career, and above all, his insight into the mind of one Mr. Brian Wilson, the genius behind the Beach Boys. David, by the way, has an exciting new book out called God Only Knows, The Story of Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, and the California Myth. It's a perfect Christmas and Hanukkah gift. Everything you ever wanted to know about the Beach Boys, but were slightly afraid to ask. And he will be autographing copies of his new book at the end of our conversation. Now, before he joins me on stage, allow me to kind of set the scene. For most of us who were around in the 60s and looking around at this very young audience, I don't think too many of you were actually born in the 60s. Maybe. It was a tumultuous time. The assassination of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, then Kennedy's brother Bobby. And this all played around a war raging in Vietnam in the 60s. And I remember, the nightly network news was full of the latest American body counts. It was a pretty awful time. Now, the Beach Boys were the perfect antidote. Sweetness, riding the waves, and of course surfing, and big stuff is surfing in Ventura County. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Leaf.
Thank you. I heard that welcome, and I'm thinking, I am really under a lot of pressure now.
You are, David, and there's no getting off the hot seat.
Okay.
I'd like to embarrass you a little bit more.
Okay.
With the truth. Here's what's been written about David. He's like an explorer who takes us along on his voyage to new discoveries. He's a master storyteller, whether he's writing or doing a documentary on John Lennon, Frank Sinatra, Brian Wilson, or the Bee Gees. He's going to show you something essential and much, much more than you ever knew. Now, the writer continued, there's a big difference between being entertained and an emotional experience. He will always give you something of substance while entertaining you all day long. And finally, one other critic wrote, and sorry to go on like this.
No, go on.
Thank you. He speaks with authority, and his unique take captures audiences on an expansive variety of topics: 20th century music, media, politics, the rock era, sports, television, baby boomers. Is there no end to your talents? The draft and the anti-Vietnam War movement, and of course, those killer bees, the Beach Boys, the Beatles, and I think the Bee Gees. Before we give David a chance to get a word in edgeways, I would like to show a short but very moving and powerful short BBC video which demonstrates the brilliance of Brian Wilson and his hit God Only Knows. But before we roll, David, is there anything, you know what I'm going to show, is there anything you want to preface it, or do you want to wait until afterwards?
Well, I think what I call it the title song of my book. It's one of Brian Wilson's greatest compositions, one of his most beloved songs. And for the BBC to have given this treatment to it is staggering. Every time I see it, I've never seen it on a big screen, so this is going to be a treat.
Okay, thank you, John. That is magnificent. Now, David will do a test at the end. If you can name the artist, you get a prize. We don't know what the prize is yet, but anyway.
No Googling.
No Googling. Oh, no Googling, yeah. How did David Leaf, a kid from New Rochelle, I think that was a place, become the world's foremost expert on Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, and particularly Brian? How did it happen for you?
The quick story is I was a Beach Boys fan in the 60s, but I was in no way, the Beatles were my gods. That was my musical religion. When I was 19 years old in college, there was a cover story on the Beach Boys in Rolling Stone magazine, written by Tom Nolan. And I read this story, and it spoke about this mythic album called Smile that had been started in 1966, been shelved in 1967. Was it ever going to be finished? Nobody knew. And there was a song called Surf's Up that was on it. I bought the new Beach Boys album, which was titled Surf's Up, and it was like, okay, this song is as good as this article says, maybe even better. Selfishly, I wanted to hear more of that Smile music. The song before Surf's Up on the album was called Till I Die. And that song is one of the saddest songs one has ever heard. It's an in my room kind of song, except it's a song of defeat. It's a song of someone who's given up. And my roommate and I became obsessed with Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, the story, what was going on. And I said, there's something wrong here. And he said, well, why don't you do something about it? And I formed in my head this notion, I'm going to move to California, write a book about Brian Wilson, become his friend, and help him finish Smile.
And did it happen?
It only took 33 years.
Can you tell us how you confronted him and how it all happened a little bit?
Well, there's a certain, I don't want to use the word serendipity because I had to move to California for any of this to happen, but I was here 36 hours. I had lost my job in New York at a television station I was working for, went out of business, so I was on unemployment insurance in New York. When I moved to California, I went to the unemployment office in Santa Monica to transfer my claim. I hadn't been here 36 hours, and I walked out of the office, and crossing the street in Santa Monica at Broadway and 5th Street, and walking towards me is Dennis Wilson, the drummer of the Beach Boys. And I walked up to Dennis. I've never been shy, overconfident, and said, "Hi, Dennis, my name is David Leaf. I just moved to California to write a book about your brother, Brian." I can still hear the echo of his laughter. He laughed, he said, "Good luck." 3 years, almost to the day of that accidental meeting, the book was in stores.
But then how were you able to do the confrontation and meet Brian? Did you hit it off as soon as you met him?
No. I met Brian as accidentally as I met Dennis. I was shooting baskets at the West Side Y with a friend of mine from college. Two guys walk onto the court. One of them is a man named Stan Love, who had just retired from the NBA. His brother, Mike Love, was the lead singer of the Beach Boys. And with him was Brian Wilson. And he said, "You guys want to play 2-on-2? And it's like, what the heck is going on? Because everything one would have read about Brian Wilson was that he was in his bedroom and never went out. And there he is on this basketball court. All offense, no D. He got the ball, he shot it. When it was his turn to play defense, not interested. Now that didn't lead to any sort of friendship or book. But when I got the contract to write the book, people who I was interviewing who were his friends liked the questions I was asking, the direction of the story, and they felt that I should get to meet Brian, not interview him, but just get to spend time with him so I could start to understand him. And that's really when I met him. So I'd been here about 2 years or so when I went over to one of his friends' apartments for dinner. And Brian, there were only 4 of us, and Brian was there, and he was depressed, he was introverted, he was sad, and he was that way off and on forever.
In the late 60s, and I want to hear from you, but I must tell you this, because I met Brian Wilson 4 times, and he never met me. And here's what happened, and we'll talk about this, I'll ask you. Derek Taylor, the brilliant publicist for the Beatles, had come over, as you know, and as I say, to do publicity for Brian. I went to Derek's house to 4 parties, and Brian was there, but he wasn't there. He sat in a high-back wicker chair for 4 hours and never said a word, honestly. So, at what stage of this almost catatonic situation did you come in and were able to flesh this whole crazy episode?
Well, I wrote the story without fleshing it out in the first edition of the book in 1978. You mentioned Derek Taylor. Derek Taylor is the man responsible for creating the notion in the British press, Brian Wilson is a genius, ... I think, which was later shortened to Brian Wilson is a genius. And there are great stories of when Paul, not yet Sir Paul McCartney, would come to Los Angeles and go to Derek's, and Brian would go over there and play him things like Good Vibrations, which hadn't come out yet. When I met Brian, he was not catatonic, he just was withdrawn, extremely withdrawn. And over the years, because of the people who were my friends, who were his friends, he began to trust me. I was not there to take advantage of him. I was just there to be his friend. And so there were visits to him in homes, in his house where he wasn't doing well. There's a visit to when he was in a hospital over Christmas, and one friend brought a little Christmas tree to set up just to bring a little bit of cheer. But the strangest first big meeting with Brian and I happened when the book was written but hadn't yet come out. The fall of 1978, the biggest Beach Boy collector in the world had come out to Los Angeles to get what I had collected during the writing of the book. He had helped me gather stuff to use in the book, and his compensation was when the book was finished, he could have everything. So he flew out here on a weekday afternoon. We dropped his suitcase off at my apartment in West Los Angeles. We went to a nearby pizza place, had pizza, came back to the apartment, and just spent the evening talking about Brian and the Beach Boys and the book and how this had all happened. And he said, every time I come to Los Angeles, I always see Rodney Bingenheimer and Harvey Kubernik, 2 big LA scene makers. Rodney on the Rock, of course, the legendary DJ, and Harvey Kubernik, who at that time was the West Coast correspondent for Melody Maker magazine. And I said, well, you're not going to see him on this trip, because he was flying back the next morning. Well, anyway, around 1 o'clock in the morning, there's a knock on my door. Who the heck is here at 1 o'clock in the morning? It's Rodney Bingenheimer, Harvey Kubernik, and with them is Brian Wilson. And Harvey says, we didn't know what to do with him, so we brought him here. And they left. And Brian came in and he sat down and he said, got anything to eat? And fortunately, there were 2 leftover slices of pizza from dinner. And I heated them up in my little toaster oven, and he wolfed them down. And then he went to sleep on the couch. And my friend and I, who have just spent a year working on this book, writing this book, collecting the stuff that went in the book, we can't talk about any of that now because Brian is right there. And we're just, how is this remotely possible? And after a couple of hours, he woke up and he said, can you give me a ride home? And I did. What I learned from that and other experiences was that Brian Wilson has had guardian angels in his life. When I came to write the edition of the book you had up on the screen earlier, God only knows, the story of Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, and the California Myth, I asked Harvey Kubernik, why did you bring Brian to my apartment that night? And he said, well, I was on my way to Rodney's, because Rodney always got the British import singles, and we were going to listen to records together. And I parked, and I saw some guy weaving in the middle of Sunset Boulevard. And I ran out, and I grabbed him and pulled him to the curb before a car hit him. And when I got him to the curb, I realized, hey, Brian, what are you doing? It was Brian Wilson. And Brian goes, I took too many Reds.
Wow.
And they went to Rodney's. Brian said, let's play some Phil Spector records. And then they said, well, what are we going to do? Should we take him to the hospital? And Harvey said, we brought him to you because you were always the adult in the room. And so that was really the first significant moment in my life where Brian Wilson was kind of left in my hands to be cared for.
I mean, on this subject, David, he's a survivor. Somebody, I think maybe in your book it said, at that time he was like Buddy Hackett on speed. And I noticed in a lot of the films he had this kind of strange demeanor. Isn't it incredible how he's survived and now he's 80 now?
He's 80.
And
yes.
I mean, I don't want to get ahead of the story, but how does one, many rock and rollers as we know, I mean, they died at 27 because of the reasons we all know they died. Why do you think Brian survived and has survived?
He is an extraordinarily strong person. He looks at a situation and he makes a determination, how am I going to survive this situation, A or B? And he goes with the direction that's going to allow him to survive. And if you ask him this question, he would say, well, my last name is Wilson, so I guess I have a lot of willpower. So he just, the strength that went into the music that we all love, that affected us so much, is also the strength that has kept him going all these years. In 1982, no one would have thought he was going to be the only surviving Wilson brother. The guess would have been he would have been the first to go.
Before we show a section from Beautiful Dreamer, which is a film that David made, a documentary that David made, and it was a very innovative film, I want to show you a short clip from that, which kind of captures a little bit of the essence of Brian Wilson, and also is superbly laid out by David in this film. So, John, can you give us a little bit of Beautiful Dreamer, please? That gives us a little bit more flavor besides what you've said, but we have 60 minutes to cover 60 years, which is kind of cutting it rather tight. How did this documentary happen? And you were there, it was your creation.
When Brian started touring in 1999, he asked me and my late wife to come on tour with him, so he would have what he called emotional security. He liked having friends there who were just there to cheer him on, because everyone else is busy working. The musicians who are his family, because musicians are the people he values the most. But everyone's got a job. We were just there to smile and cheer. And in the summer of 2003, we were coming back from the movies, he and I, walking up the Santa Monica 3rd Street Promenade, and he said to me, I really want you to be there every day with me when I'm working on Smile. I'm going to be putting it all, it had been announced that he was going to be doing a thing called Brian Wilson Presents Smile at Royal Festival in London in February of 2004, and summer of 2003, he says, I really need you to be there every day. I was like, well, Brian, I have a production company. I can't be there every day unless I'm making a documentary about it. And he said, okay. I mean, it's just as simple as that. And you know, when we talked to his wife about it, Melinda, she said, what's this film going to be about? And I said, this film is not for Beach Boys fans. It's really not even for Brian Wilson fans. It's for people to understand the triumph of the human spirit. That a great artist could put something on the shelf in 1967 and return to it over 30 years later and finish it. And that was the story I set out to tell.
We touched upon this a moment ago, David, but some of us, and many in the audience, I'm sure, just got little fragments of this stuff. Brian was crazy. Brian had in his house, he had a sandbox with the piano.
Yes.
How much of this stuff was true, and was it exaggerated, or what?
There's a documentary called I Just Wasn't Made for These Times that Don Was did. You can see it on YouTube. It's about 73 minutes long. And in it, Brian's best friend, Danny Hutton, one of the lead singers of Three Dog Night, is quoted that when you're in the record business and you're having hit records, you're considered eccentric when you do the things Brian does. When you stop having hits, they just think you're crazy. So in 1966, at the height of Brian's musical powers and the Beach Boys' worldwide fame, as Good Vibrations is becoming a #1 hit everywhere, he decides that he's going to have a sandbox in his living room, put the piano in the sandbox, and play with his bare feet because he likes the feel of what it's like to be at the beach. He doesn't surf, but he likes the idea of it. So it's true. And in fact, for the 20th for the program that was done for Brian's tour this year, we finally found a picture of him actually in the sandbox. So we know it's true. He also one day decided he wanted to have a tent in the living room. So a tent was brought in. Another time he said, we need to have tumbling mats, we need to exercise, we need to get into good shape. So furniture's cleared out of the living room and tumbling mats are brought in. It's all true. Again, these are eccentricities when you're having hit records. Then they become mythological examples of how crazy somebody is. He had a tent in his house. You know, it sounds crazy. He had a sandbox. The piano was in the sandbox. That sounds crazy. But when you're an artist, we don't really know what Michelangelo or Da Vinci or Mozart or any of those people were doing when they were creating their work. Great artists go to extremes to make great art.
Can you imagine going to see the Beatles on tour when Paul McCartney didn't show up? Now, that's what happened with Brian.
Yes. Brian never liked being in front of an audience. He was deaf in one ear, and in those days the sound equipment was terrible. So the sound hurt his good ear. Plus, when they would get back from tour, the pressure was on him to write a new album and then go in the studio and produce it. And I was like, guys, I can't do both. So he stopped. He stopped touring.
I'd like to show another...
But to finish answering your question, when I saw the Beach Boys in 1967, unlike the Beatles, when you got the album Meet the Beatles in 1964, which pretty much everyone in my generation got, you turned it over and there's a picture of the Beatles and it has their names underneath it. Well, the early Beach Boys albums didn't have their names. You didn't know it was just the Beach Boys. So when I went to see them in concert, I had never even heard the name Brian Wilson. I didn't know who was on the stage. These guys just sounded great, sounded like they hit records.
Another video I'd like to show kind of shows the way the Beach Boys were back in the old days. And it's from a show called The Tammy Show. What was The Tammy Show?
So there was a very ambitious entrepreneur who came up with this process that he thought was going to beam this concert into movie theaters around the country, film it and show it everywhere. And they gathered an amazing array of stars: the Rolling Stones, James Brown, the early Motown superstars are on this. This is the fall of 1964 at the Santa Monica Civic, and the Beach Boys are on the bill as well. And this is just about 4 or 5 weeks before Brian had a nervous breakdown and stopped touring. So this is the last time you see the original Beach Boys on a concert stage in their striped shirts, as the kind of the image that we all have of them.
Thank you. John, can you roll The Tammy Show? Thank you. Most of you remember that not long ago, Peter Jackson did a 4 hours or 6 hours, was it?
Almost 7.5.
Almost 7 hour thing about the Beatles in creation, of course. And so I rather like the video that David sent me, which is an opportunity to see good vibrations being created in the studio, because very few of us actually go to the studio unless you're like Todd, a rock and roll writer. But so can we see a little bit of the Beach Boys creating good vibrations and how it works?
Why not?
David, do you enjoy going into the studio and watching this take place?
Actually, the studio is one of the dullest places in the universe because it's over and over and over again, things that you don't necessarily hear. Now, that said, the first time I was in the studio to see a major record recorded I was with the Bee Gees, and everyone had gone home. Barry Gibb said to me, "Oh, you can stay if you want." I was like, "Yeah, I want to stay." And I sat on a couch. Behind me was the desk where the engineers were, and glass booth, and Barry's on the other side. He has the lights lowered, and he starts recording the lead vocal for a song I'd never heard before. And I'm thinking to myself, this is unbelievable. Is this as good as I think it is? It's a song called Too Much Heaven. And it not only became a #1 hit, but it was a song the Bee Gees donated to UNICEF. And about 20 years after I saw it being recorded, I was in a hotel room in Cleveland when Barry Gibb was teaching the song to Brian Wilson, because Brian was inducting the Bee Gees into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and singing that song. And so those are goosebump moments. But most of what goes on in the studio, I mean, this little bit of footage that has been cobbled together to the original recording of Good Vibrations isn't really, you don't really see much at work. You see Hal Blaine on the drums, you see Ray Pullman on guitar, you see Mike Melvoin on the organ, you see Carl Wilson playing a little bass guitar. But the way Brian produced was he created the instrumental track first. And on his greatest albums like Pet Sounds and Smile, Beach Boys weren't even in the country, let alone in the studio. So they record the tracks, and then when they came back to town, he would have them come into the studio to record the vocals. That was a whole different process. Essentially in 3 hours, Brian would record a master track.
in your first book, writing about Brian Wilson in 1978, you wrote, "This is the story of Brian Wilson, an unpretentious kid who fooled around at the piano, captured the teenage soul, and became an artist. Brian created a California myth through his music, and ultimately he became the myth's most tragic victim." Is Brian Wilson still a victim in your mind?
No. No, I mean, the great thing about writing God Only Knows was that I was writing in celebration of what he's accomplished, having come out of the dark side. He was under the control of a very mad doctor. I don't even like to use the word doctor in regard to him. He was a psychologist who, when it was all over and Brian was asked, what were those 9 years like? He said it was like being in prison for 9 years. Yeah. But in the subsequent years after that, Brian had a personal redemption and an artistic renaissance of his own beyond what anyone could have imagined at any point in the 70s or 80s. It was just remarkable what he accomplished, and it gave him great satisfaction. Nothing made him happier than playing Smile live. He just was, I mean, he wrote it, it's called Smile. Why? Because he believed in the cliche, laughter is the best medicine. And Brian thinks of his music as something that heals people. So Smile to him was music that would heal. And it healed the audience, it healed me, it healed him.
A moment ago you touched upon the shrink psychologist Eugene Landy, who was featured very heavily in the 2014 feature movie Love and Mercy. And I think I asked you what you thought of that. Do you think it overemphasized this Svengali Dr. Landy who took over his life? And indeed, it's hard to imagine that happening.
Well, we hear about things like this happening all the time. It's just usually not somebody who's that famous. I mean, Britney Spears just got out of a somewhat similar situation. There's a couple of ironies attached to what happened with Dr. Landy. I saw Brian in the fall of 1982, and it was clear that he was going to die soon. And shortly after that, the Beach Boys hired Landy to keep Brian alive. One could write an entire book on the why and wherefore of that. So that was good. He kept Brian alive. In the movie, there's a scene where Brian goes to buy a car. He buys a Cadillac. This is supposed to be a therapeutic exercise where he's going to go in and buy a car, and he does. And Landy decides that the car saleswoman is someone Brian should ask out on a date. The irony of that is that woman, who is now Brian's second wife, led the charge to get rid of Landy. So in a sense, he created his own, as somebody said to me, his own Trojan horse. But Landy did something else that is almost never remarked upon. He forced Brian to have a solo career. The Beach Boys existed as a business, and Brian Wilson was at the center of that business, whether he was active or not. He was essential to that business. And Landy was interested in what was best for Landy. And by taking Brian solo, he had complete control over what was going on. He didn't have to ask the Beach Boys what they thought. And it worked for Brian creatively, thanks to great people like Lenny Waronker and Russ Titleman and Andy Paley and Jeff Lynne and others. But it created a world where Brian Wilson came to understand that people wanted to hear Brian Wilson music. And so in the Don Was movie, when he's asked, what happened with you and the Beach Boys that you're not with them anymore, he very simply says they wanted to make their kind of music, and I wanted to make my kind of music. And so he kept them alive. He brought Melinda into the picture and created the solo career. And for us on the outside, that's great. For Brian, it was a horrendous experience to be in this 24/7 lockdown for 9 years.
So, in your mind, was Landy a villain, or was he a villain with special explanation?
He was a villain.
Yeah.
He was a bad guy.
Yeah.
I mean, the encounters I had with him, it was like there's a hissing snake on your shoulder, and you're wondering when the snake is going to strike. I mean, it was really, I can't imagine 9 hours with the man, let alone 9 years. So glad that he's gone.
Changing the subject very slightly, but we will get back to Brian. Our conversation tonight, by pure coincidence, takes place today, December the 8th. It's the anniversary of the murder of John Lennon, who was gunned down in 1980 outside the Dakota apartments, and John was only 41. So,
40.
40, okay, I stand corrected, sorry. Can you tell us, again, you did a brilliant documentary called John Lennon versus the USA. Can you tell us how you got involved in that and why that fascinated you?
Well, it happened almost simultaneous to my obsession with Brian Wilson. I was a Beatle nut. There's no other word to describe it in the 60s. When I went to college at George Washington University, my dorm was 5 blocks from the White House. And it was during the anti-war years, it was during the Nixon administration, all of these student demonstrations. And I saw firsthand, I used to sort of joke, we got tear gassed whether we wanted to or not. I mean, it was a very contentious time. And I remember one morning lifting the blinds of my dorm room, which faced Pennsylvania Avenue at 21st Street. It was the day of a big demonstration, 7:30 in the morning, and it was either the 81st or the 82nd Airborne Division. Men were getting out of trucks to surround the campus so we wouldn't be able to get off campus to go to the demonstration. And I remember turning to my roommate, I said, are we in Venezuela? I mean, what is going on? We're going to express the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly. And I remember walking past the Rick Nixon's re-election office. Big letters at the top, it said CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. And I turned to my friend who was the editor-in-chief of the college newspaper. I said, that's a perfect description. So in a sense, the U.S. versus John Lennon was that was born then the same way the Beautiful Dreamer film was born. It was a remarkable series of circumstances, again, that I got to make that film. It was after I had made a documentary on the Bee Gees called This Is Where I Came In, and the head of the home video company who was distributing it said, it was great working with you. Do you have any other ideas? I'd love to work with you again. And I told him, I said, I want to make this movie called The Secret War Against John Lennon. And he said, well, do you know Peter Schucat, who was at that point the Lennon estate attorney? And he introduced me, and it took years and years to develop. And by the time it came out, I'd been in a room. The most difficult thing of making a documentary, believe it or not, is getting the money. I guess it's not that hard to believe. But I had to get Yoko's blessing to be allowed to go into rooms, and I'd go into a Paramount or Lionsgate, whomever, and the executive would be sitting in the chair like this, and they would say, okay, well, this story sounds good, but how are you going to get Yoko's permission to do it? And I'd say, well, we already have Yoko's permission, and they would sit up very straight. And I remember being in a meeting, I said, it's like a boxing match. Think of it, a world heavyweight fight. It's the U.S. versus John Lennon. And when I said it, I thought to myself, okay, that's going to be the title of the movie.
I'd like to, now you've set the scene, to ask John if he would run the trailer of this film, which is actually very powerful. And if you haven't seen it, you should see it. David, here is a what-if question. as you know and the world knows, John Lennon battled for many years to avoid deportation back to England. Would he, silly question, but would he be alive, do you think, if he'd lost that battle?
Yes.
Yes.
He would have, if he had lost the battle to get a green card in the mid-70s, he would have gone back to England. And watching the trailer and seeing all those people who I interviewed, it's a surreal experience to sit with Gordon Liddy and Noam Chomsky and Gore Vidal and the late Governor Mario Cuomo, and get to ask them the questions that extract the sound bites that end up in a film.
Changing subject slightly, the rivalry between the Beatles and the Beach Boys, did it exist?
It most definitely existed for a short period of time. When the Beatles first hit, Brian and his cousin Mike and the Beach Boys got together and said, "We've got to up our game." It's like they couldn't compete culturally, they couldn't compete sociologically, they can compete musically. And so I think the first single was "I Get Around" back with "Don't Worry Baby," one of the greatest singles ever made. Fall of '65, Rubber Soul comes out. Brian says, "I'm going to make an album like that. I'm going to make the greatest album ever made," and he makes Pet Sounds. The Beatles hear Pet Sounds, and they're inspired. One of the most amazing things I was ever told in an interview setting was Sir George Martin said, "Sgt. Pepper was our attempt to equal Pet Sounds. Not that we did, not that we bettered it." And he also said, if I had to select one living genius of popular music, it would be Brian Wilson. And that's the guy who was in the room when the Beatles made all those records. So that gives you a sense of how admired Brian was.
Yeah, George Martin, of course, for those I'm sure you know, was, I would say, the creative musical genius after the lollipop music of the early Beatles and then all the orchestral stuff that came later, probably not well put.
He helped them realize things musically through electronics and through studio tricks that they didn't know how to express. And he also was a great orchestrator and arranger.
We have a very short video of Paul and Brian talking about, well, you'll see, about each other and about rivalry, if you like. John? Elaborate a little bit, David, on that, because I understand that Paul and Brian became very bosom buddies.
Paul loves Brian. Brian loves Paul. Somebody asked Brian on the web not long ago, if you could be anyone else in the world, who would you be? And his answer, he held up a card that said Paul McCartney. Yeah. Of course, I think most of us would hold up that card as well. Brian's music did something that Paul can't explain, but I asked him to write an introduction for this edition of the book, and he wrote back, he said, "I'm too busy to write a big introduction, but will this do?" And it's a quote about the song God Only Knows, how it makes him cry, and he tries to explain it, and he says, but that's the genius of Brian Wilson. So if Sir Paul McCartney says that, Sir Barry Gibb wrote an essay for the book as well. Jimmy Webb, one of the greatest songwriters of his generation or any generation, wrote the introduction for this edition of the book. And Sir Elton John provided all these amazing quotes about how much he loves Brian, and it goes from Bob Dylan to Questlove. We were talking about John Lennon. John's younger son, Sean, says Brian Wilson is my Bach. So I think it gives you a sense that Brian Wilson is here because of the personal difficulties had. There's nobody who feels any envy for him because he has lived an emotional roller coaster beyond any imagination.
David, not long ago I heard you on Chris Carter's Breakfast with the Beatles tell a wonderful story about Brian and Paul going to Buckingham Palace to meet the Queen.
Yes. In
the late Queen.
The late Queen. Well, they didn't go to meet her. They went there to play the Jubilee concert, 50th anniversary of her coronation. In 2001, Brian was on tour in England, and I was called to a meeting with a representative of Buckingham Palace and the late great producer Phil Ramone, who was going to be one of the musical producers of the event. And I didn't really understand the import of this moment, but I won't do a bad accent, but it was a very, very stuffy accent. So, is there any chance Brian might come to the Jubilee? Well, let me ask. I don't see any reason why he wouldn't. And so in June of 2002, we found ourselves at Buckingham Palace. And it was a remarkable experience. Now, this was after 9/11, and security was unbelievably tight. We were on a golf cart being driven on this path from security to the stage area, and they're telling us what not to do. Don't leave the path. Don't go on the grass because there are trained snipers in the trees. So it was a little nerve-wracking. Anyway, I know we're running out of time. I won't tell the whole story, but at the end of the concert, everybody had been instructing you, do not address the Queen unless she addresses you. But after the last song, the final encore, and the late Queen Elizabeth is walking to the stage, Brian cannot resist, and he pushes Ozzy Osbourne out of the way, and, "Hi, Queen!" So that's Brian Wilson. There's a childlike quality, a sweetness about him. He doesn't have an ironic bone in his body. He doesn't have a mean bone in his body. He is as sweet as the music.
I know we are running out, but I'm going to ask you one more question before we get to the questions from the audience and questions from the Zoom crowd. Do you think that Brian, for too long, was underappreciated?
Absolutely. One of the driving passions of my writing the original edition of the book in 1978 was I wanted to grab the world by the collar and say, you got to pay attention to this guy. He's really important. Nowadays, you just Google his name and you'll see a whole bunch of quotes about how great Brian Wilson is. Well, back then, obviously, you couldn't do that. And he was caught up in this traveling circus that the Beach Boys had become. And they were selling out stadiums. People were coming to hear the hits. We all loved the Beach Boys hits. But Brian Wilson, I knew from everything I'd read, everything I'd heard, was much more than that. And that really was driving me to write the book. This time around, it was more, I was talking with his wife and saying, I don't know what to give Brian for his 80th birthday. Maybe a new edition of the book would be the thing to do. And she wrote a very lovely essay as well for the book.
Good. I think we have some questions, Marissa?
Yes, we do. So we're going to start the Q&A portion of this evening, and we will be taking questions both from our Zoom and our live audience. So if you have a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand, and myself or Trisha over there will extend the microphone. To give you all a minute to gather your thoughts, I'm going to go ahead and start with a question from our Zoom audience. So Joy G at Hotmail has a question for you, David. Was Brian Wilson involved in the film made about his life, and did he like the movie?
Yes and yes. And I like the movie very much as well. The only things I didn't feel were right about the movie is I thought Brian's father should have been portrayed. Yes, he was a bad guy in terms of the abuse, but we should have seen that he understood how brilliant Brian was musically. And he created a music room for Brian in his house. He got him a reel-to-reel tape recorder for Brian to deconstruct 4 freshman harmonies. So I thought we could have seen that. And the other thing that bothered me was they made the great musician, composer, lyricist Van Dyke Parks, they made him out to be like a stoned hippie. And I thought that was terrible. He and Brian are the ones who wrote Smile together. So I didn't like that. But otherwise, I thought it was a good movie, a very good movie.
Could you tell us a little bit about Brian's relationship with the other Beach Boys? I mean, did they appreciate him? Did they think he was a kook? Was he the money machine? How did he get along with Carl and Dennis and Mike Love and everyone else?
I think you just answered it exactly right. They loved him. They appreciated him. They thought he was, to use your word, a kook, because Brian was eccentric, is eccentric. He's a great artist. I mean, great artists, are not ordinary people. Dennis would kill anybody who tried to get at Brian and hurt him. There were a lot of fist fights. Carl was the peacemaker. Al Jardine, Brian's friend from high school, still a great singer. There was no issues between he and Brian. Mike Love, as the front man of the group, found himself pleasing an audience and pleasing the Beach Boys and pleasing Brian. So he was in a conflicted place. What was going to work best for the show, not necessarily what was going to be best for the recordings. So there was some conflict there. But the line that's in the book that sticks with me, that I wrote it 44 years ago, is, it gets complicated. There's the family's love of Brian, and then there's the family's love of fame and fortune. And those are very, very different values.
I recall reading at some point that there was a connection between Charles Manson and one of Brian Wilson's younger brothers. And so I'm curious, because he was trying to get his music picked up, if Brian Wilson ever heard Charles Manson's music, and he ever commented on that to you.
Brian never commented on it. I don't know if he ever did, but there was a song on a demo tape that Manson recorded called "Cease to Exist" that ended up on the Beach Boys album 2020 called "Never Learn Not to Love," credited to Dennis Wilson. Dennis Wilson is the one who had the relationship with the Manson family.
David, I presume you still have a relationship with Brian, and if so, tell us what he's doing at 80. What's he doing this week? What's he doing this year?
He was on tour for several months earlier this year with Chicago. Physical therapy. Brian's two great loves, besides laughter, were eating and music. I think eating may have surpassed music. But in general, he loves to watch Jeopardy. That's like, I guess maybe, that's, who doesn't love Jeopardy? So that may be the most normal thing about him. He's 80. He's quieter than he was. But we had a lot of times. I mean, two of my proudest possessions. On Sunset Boulevard, on Hollywood Boulevard, they had these souvenir shops where you could go and buy trophies that looked like Oscars. World's best mom, world's best dad, whatever. He got me two trophies there. World's best comic and world's best writer, because we used to laugh all the time, and I couldn't even tell you why we were laughing. We were. He's really a regular guy with extraordinary powers. He's like Clark Kent and Superman in one body. You're welcome.
Thank you for being here. Can you talk about his relationship to playing concerts now? Because, he left to be away from things, and he has a little more control because it's his music. But the anxiety of coming into it?
Sure. I remember when it was announced that he was going to go on tour, and my wife and I both looked at each other and said, "That's the worst idea I've ever heard." Sure glad it wasn't mine. This was in late '98, and about 2 weeks before the tour started, Brian called and said, "You guys need to come out here. I need you here." So we found ourselves with him on his very first solo tour in March of 1999. And he was nervous, but he grew every night, because what he found out that was so important was that people wanted to hear Brian Wilson. He had been told, to go back to what this gentleman asked me before, he had been told that his music only worked within the confines of the Beach Boys. And suddenly there was an audience giving him standing ovations as Brian Wilson. And it just built him up. The second or third tour was in Wisconsin. He did an ad-libbed version of On Wisconsin. I mean, he started telling jokes on stage. I mean, he really came into his own. If he hadn't gone on tour, all of the great work that happened since then wouldn't have happened. And it all came from something that made me scratch my head. It's like, Brian's going to go on tour? This guy who hates to be in front of an audience? And I had worked on several shows where he had performed, nervous as could be. But yeah, he's nervous before every show. But the two things that he did that really defined the difference between he and the Beach Boys is, before every show, he and his band would gather in a prayer circle. And every show would end with an encore of Love and Mercy. And to me, that really told you what you needed to know about Brian Wilson. Love and Mercy, he would say to the audience, is what you need tonight. Love and Mercy is what I need tonight. He's singing to himself as well. And it was really beautiful moments, and he came to love it. He really came to love it.
I wonder if you would speculate a little bit on if Brian had completed Smile back in the day, what the reception might have been, how it might have changed the trajectory of his career.
That's one of those impossible questions to even answer intelligently, but I'll try. If he had completed Smile, it would have caused a stir within the music world. Whether the Beach Boys audience would have responded well to it or not, I can't guess at. Capitol Records was already unhappy with the Beach Boys because of Pet Sounds. They had sort of given up on the Beach Boys as a band, and they were starting to put out this endless stream of greatest hits albums. But Pet Sounds probably should have been a solo album. It was what I would think of as Brian's emotional autobiography on record. Smile was extraordinarily experimental for its time, and even when he finally finished it, it was very, very different from what people thought of in popular music. What would have happened more than anything that would have mattered was that if Smile had come out in 1967, it wouldn't have been the albatross it became on Brian. It became just this weight. When he walked away, he sacrificed himself on the altar of Smile for the Beach Boys, because it had been drilled into him by his father that it would be disloyal to do anything that would hurt the Beach Boys. And so that's what happened to Smile. What it would have meant to the world, who knows, but it would have changed my life for sure. I wouldn't have come out here to write a book about Brian Wilson because I would have heard Smile.
Have you thought of inviting Brian to join you at UCLA in some of your lectures, and what might he contribute to today's music writers and producers with the eclectic situation that we're seeing all over the music scene?
I'm surprised that Brian's music isn't being sampled, considering how hook-filled his records and songs are. In terms of my UCLA classes, for those of you who don't know, I teach 3 courses at UCLA, one on documentary making, one called Songwriters on Songwriting, and one called The Real Beatles, spelled R-E-E-L. The songwriting class, I invite great songwriters to come in, sit at the piano, or with their acoustic guitar, and I take them through their life and song. That does not seem to be a venue where Brian would flourish. He doesn't like being interviewed. When I made the Beautiful Dreamer film, it was an enclosed studio. There was no big audience. He was relaxed. He knew the cameraman. He knew me, and I got a great interview from him in front of a couple hundred people. I don't know how it would go for him, but it's not something he needs to do. He has answered pretty much every question about his life and career a dozen or 100 times. So he doesn't need to come to my class. So as a friend, I wouldn't kind of impose on him to ask.
David, we have a question from our Zoom audience. James wants to know, to what extent did Brian contribute to the new music on his recent releases? He wants to know, are these songs that were truly written by Brian, or did collaborators play a large part in reference to no peer pressure, etc.?
A very good question, and one I'll sort of dodge. Part of what I did in the update which is more than half the length of the original book, so it's not just a short update for those of you who have the original book, is talk about what I witnessed myself, the journey that I went on with Brian, the experiences I had with him, where I was a fly on the wall. And I wasn't around when he made the 2015 album. I know that some of the songs are really sad, and Brian's pretty great at writing sad songs. The album that I love of his recently came out a year ago called At My Piano, and it's just Brian at the piano playing more than a dozen of his greatest compositions. And when I first got it and put it on, I was expecting him to be singing those songs. It was great. Ooh, it's going to kind of be like hearing Brian doing demos of these great songs, but it's just him at the piano. So I was disappointed the first time. The second time I listened to it, there was a tenderness to it that I loved. So James, I'm sorry I wasn't able to answer your question. I know that I've been told that on the last Beach Boys album, which is 10 years ago, and titled That's Why God Made the Radio, the title song came out because supposedly they were having a meal with a bunch of people who were going to be working on the album, and one of the guys was talking about how he loved growing up and hearing Beach Boys songs on the radio, and Brian, like a bite of a cheeseburger, said, well, that's why God made the radio. and so he contributes. The percentages, I don't know.
Okay, I think if there are no more questions, we will definitely invite David back, and he said he would sing the Beach Boys' greatest hits. Is that right, David? Thank you.
You're applauding without hearing me sing. That's a little too fast. Is the band here? The band didn't show?
But you said we didn't need a band.
So what would you like to hear? I'm a ham, so what?
You're a ham, of course. Okay, well then, give us your party piece, if there is a party piece.
A parting piece?
Party piece.
Oh God, I'm the wrong person to sing at a party. I'll end the party if I sing.
Yeah.
No, you had asked me if I would sing God Only Knows.
Yes.
And it's funny, God only knows how many times I've sung that song along to the record or in concert, and you think you know the words, but I brought them just in case. Well, anyway, it would be great if you would sing it with me, because that would help a lot. Are there any French horn players in the house? No French horn? Do I have to do the French horn too?
You do.
Okay.
Brilliant. More.
Let's find a key that I can hit. I may not always love you, but long as there are stars above you, you never need to doubt it. I'll make you so sure about it. God only knows what I'd be without you.
Wow. David, you delivered. Thank you so much indeed. Let's hear it for David, and then I think we've got some public service announcements to go. David, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.